I will explain shortly some of the results for each of them. Regarding cross-border institutional dissimilarity and similarity, we identified 3 issues here, which are the ones you can see. Regarding identity, we acknowledged and identified that, especially from the Spanish Sardaña side, there was a feeling that the French behave with a certain sense of superiority, and that didn't help in the development of a common identity in the area. But in terms of similarity, we also identified that there is a certain revival of the Catalan identity on the French side, which actually helps in this process to get closer in terms of identity in this destination or in this zone area. In terms of function, there is a number of dissimilarities, like daily eating routines, taxis, and so on and so forth. But there is also one very clear similarity in terms of function in the case of the cross-border hospital that has been built in Puigcerdà and that gives service to the whole area and has been just built a few years ago and just opened very recently. Regarding organization, what we identified here is that the structures for tourism management were very different in both sides of the border. They were not comparable, and that dificulted also the process. But also during the last 2-3 years, there has been a process of convergence of these structures, and nowadays both sides of the border has a much more similar organizational structure, which has also helped in the process. Regarding the role of bridging actors and institutions, one of the most important findings of our research was the role of the community of Libya as a neutral agent. It is probably very common to see neutral actors in these kind of processes, but it's not that common to see a whole community acting the role of a neutral actor in the process. And that is the case of Libya. Both the French and the Spanish see in Libya a neutral actor, and this has helped a lot in the process. And Libya has also led the process because they have acknowledged themselves as having this role. But besides the role of Libya as a whole community, there is a number of specific actors that have also helped a lot in the process, and we just mentioned a couple of examples here, specifically the case of a Libyan politician and a French Business Association representative that were actually 2 of the most important persons in this process, as has already been explained in the case in the article that constitutes the 3rd article in the thesis. Regarding the 3rd factor, which is leadership and financing, we have identified and acknowledged that the private sector always takes the lead. They always recognize opportunities, and they always move forward, the first ones, but they always need, or probably in most cases, they need the public sector to finance and ensure the financing of the processes. So again, in our case, was this the case that the private sector started the processes and the public sector followed to ensure financing. We also recognize that not all the actors in the process have the same impetus, we could say, or the same importance. Actually, many of the actors remain passive in the process, and there are just a few of them that are actually active in the process, and the ones we call the actual champions of the process. And we recognize that these are the ones that should get most of the support in order to ensure these kind of processes elsewhere. Regarding the types of relationships, we have identified 3 kinds of relationships, which are business relationships, personal relationships, and issues related with power. Regarding business, we identified again one business, which is inter-Sardaña business. They were the first to start creating cross-border products back in the 80s. They started to put up products, mixing accommodation in the Spanish side with ski resorts in the French side. Regarding personal relationships, again, the Libyan politician and the French Business Association representative, they were friends. They were very close friends. And that is very important for the process, as we have seen in our case. And regarding power struggles, they may threaten these kind of processes. And in our case, at least, we found that both villages, Les Angles and Font-Romeu, which are the most important tourism resorts in the French side, they actually were outsiders in our process. They have not been involved. But that was not enough to stop the process in our case. So there were power struggles, but in our case, they did not stop the process. And finally, we need to add serendipity as a concurrence of factors, of questions that could not be foreseen in advance. For instance, the case of Font-Romeu leaving the Cerdanya Communauté de Communes and asking to be included in the neighboring Capcir Communauté de Communes, that pulled the trigger, and that moved all the process, that pushed everything and moved everything. And nobody could expect that Font-Romeu would leave the Cerdanya Communauté de Communes, so that was serendipity. Again, the organization of events, very important events in this process, like Welcome Winter and the Assise du Nordique. These two events were very important in the process, but again, nobody could expect what was going to happen in this, or even the organization of these events was a sort of a little serendipity. So, once we have said all this, I will try to wrap up the conclusions in two different sections, following the issues that have been covered in these three articles, and getting a little bit back again to the introduction and the research questions. There is two main issues I would like to highlight as conclusions. First of all, regarding the tourism destinations attributes, these new tourism zones or new tourism destinations attributes, limits, and effectiveness, we have contributed with a number of methodological issues. For instance, the mixture of the geographical information systems and the cluster analysis methods is one of the contributions, and also the contribution of first using distance in kilometers, but then modifying this distance in real distance in time between the attractions to ensure that this was more suitable of the consumption patterns of tourists. We have also identified a number of aspects of issues that are important for the creation of new tourism destinations. For instance, we have recognized the specificity, intensity, and variety of attractions. We have recognized that a number of borders can actually be positive in these processes, the importance of population, and other questions. And finally, at least in our case, we have shown the effectiveness of the new tourism zones compared to the administrative regions. And moving to the second section of conclusions, and regarding to the emergence of the governance structures and the role of stakeholders in cross-border regions, we have identified a number of questions. I just explained a little bit in the case of the Cerdanya Valley, and I will get through very quickly again. There is a number of cross-border institutional similarities and dissimilarities we just mentioned. There is a number of neutral actors that have the role of bridging over the border and helping in the creation of these new tourism destinations. We have identified that private sector is always taking the lead. They are the natural leaders in our process, and they always need a public sector to ensure finance. The active players in the process are actually the real champions of the process. They always are a few of them. They are not all the actors involved. There is a number of business and personal relationships we identified in the case specifically of the Libyan politician and the French business representative. And we added also as a last factor the serendipity as a concurrence of issues that cannot be foreseen in advance and that also influence in this process, positively or negatively. So, to conclude with this last slide, future research can take different directions. The first thing we think we should do is to compare these results with the actual behavior of tourists in these tourism zones. This still remains to be done. It would be very interesting to see if tourists actually consider these tourism zones for their tourism activities and their vacations. We also think that we can move from the hub-and-spoke pattern to a more multi-destination pattern. This was an exercise we explored in the first article, but we think this can be done much more in deep, because we strongly think that the hub-and-spoke tourism zones can be actually considered and be seen as a stage in a multi-destination travel or trip. And finally, there is a number of issues related with the destination governance and management that challenges at the local level in cross-border context, and this can be also, all this knowledge can be also used to compare the results we have just shown elsewhere in other cross-border regions with similar nature. So this was the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.